Hey, my name is Sruti. I'm an author and spiritual teacher, and I write and talk about my experience of spiritual awakening and chronic pain. In 2018, I had an allergic reaction to an ear piercing that radically altered my appearance and my life. The condition, which is rare, is called erythromelalgia and feels like you have a hot frying pan stuck to your ear and face. I was also on prednisone for 6 years, which radically altered my appearance for the duration of the illness. Most doctors didn't think I would recover, but that is why I'm sharing what I have to share, because it helped me get through it, and it can help you get through your problems too. Hope you enjoy. When I was younger, I watched a documentary on Jim Jones, and I was particularly struck by a couple of things. First, the survivors, which were very few, insisted that they had never intended to join a cult and that it could happen to anyone, and that the cult didn't start off as a cult. It sort of crept up on them over time in such a way where it was almost unnoticeable until it was too late. I was particularly struck by a man who survived because he ran and hid in the woods while everyone else was literally drinking the Kool-Aid. So he begged his wife and kid to come with him, but they wouldn't because they were loyal to Jim Jones and didn't believe that anything bad could happen to them. Now, we're all familiar with this term drinking the Kool-Aid because what it means is that the Kool-Aid was poisoned. Jim Jones poisoned everyone. They followed him to their death. And actually, this wasn't only loyalty. There were also men enforcing this with guns. So by the time it had gotten to this point, these rather ordinary people who were just looking for a better life and willing to experiment with different ways of living in society had followed Jim Jones, moved to a foreign country in a rather rural jungle area, and had given all of their resources and money and financial assets to the group. So they no longer had any form of financial, mental, emotional, social independence. And again, what struck me was how this crept up on people over time and how the survivors just insisted this could happen to absolutely anyone. And that surprised me. As someone who was always very, very independent personality, independent thought process, very introverted, not prone to following trends, not prone to following other people. I'm just about as much of a loner as they come. And the only reason I'm not in the backwoods is, although I was in the backwoods, is because I'm female, and it's very hard to be a loner and a female in society, which we're not going to totally get into right now. One thing, though, that I did know very clearly from watching that Jim Jones documentary and then watching countless movies and videos and documentaries on cults, is that despite everything, when the ish hits the fan, as YouTubers like to say to avoid saying profanity online, when the ish hits the fan, and despite all your best efforts, you might find yourself in a cult, I knew that I would be that man who survived because of his independence of thought, his stubbornness and his willingness to be the only one going against an entire group of people for the purposes of truth and survival and love. And as he spoke, I remember how much pain he was, because he had to leave his family to do that, and his family died. His wife and his kid died. They wouldn't go with him. They valued Jim Jones more than they valued his insight into the matter. Anyway, I knew very clearly that I was that man, that I would have the specific personality traits, whatever was going on with that man, that was me. And I would be that one person who, against all odds, escaped a cult scenario. And so fast forward a few years later, and I find myself in a foreign country, in the dark, at night, by myself, in a rural area that's probably an hour and a half from the nearest, an hour and a half from where I was staying in a village, which was another 2 or 3 hours from the nearest capital city where there were airports. So I'm in a very, very rural situation. It's nighttime. In order to get to this place where I was with this community, I had to know people. I had to be driven there. I didn't have my own form of transportation. And I did not, it was so complicated to get there that I had no idea even how to get out without having someone drive me back to where I was staying. So, and yet I found myself in a situation where I was not being treated properly, told everyone I had to leave immediately, and then started to not trust anyone to get me out of there. So I started walking down the single dirt road that was unpaved through probably 20 minutes of woods, just woods, just forest, no civilization. And by the time I was going to be able to walk to the end of this road, it was going to take me like an hour and a half just to do that. It was already late at night, at which point at the end of the dirt road, you have to walk another 10 minutes to get to a teeny tiny village that I don't even know the name of. In a foreign country where I don't speak the language, where the whole village is shut down because it's night. And I have no way, I have no shelter, I don't have resources. So, I did it anyway. Despite how risky it sounds, I didn't feel afraid. I was actually so traumatized that I experienced what I often talk about, where all the layers of your person and personality in moments of pain disappear. And what's left is not just vapid nothingness. What's left underneath all of those layers of your mind and your feelings and your body and everything is pure conscious awareness. Your pure self with a capital S. The self that is connected to everyone and everything, and that some might call God. The source of God within you is what is left when you are in so much pain that all of the layers of who you think you are vanish. And so this is a really positive thing because there's no fear there. And it's also the source of true strength, true intelligence, true intuition, true knowledge. So the effect of that was that I felt both probably the freest I've ever felt in my whole life. I felt sort of, you might say, high, but I wasn't on any drugs. And I sort of knew what to do in a very calm, orderly fashion. So I knew that it was time for me to start walking down that road by myself, to just calmly collect my things and just start walking. So I did. There were people who had transportation who zoomed by me on the road rather rudely at first, who had been in the group that I had just told basically that I was leaving and done with. And to my surprise, a car stopped next to me. I'd only been walking for 5 or 10 minutes, and it was a young woman my age, and she had been in the community also, but she was very friendly towards me, and she was shy, but she said, would you like a ride? And at that point, it was more of like a, you need a ride, get in. So I got in, didn't know her. We drove in silence, a sort of a friendly silence. And when we reached the village, I told her, it's okay, you can drop me here. And I think that there are people who will be looking for me, people who had driven me there. Also, luckily, where I was staying, a beautiful older woman had arrived just days before this incident. And so instead of my regular host driving me to this backwoods place, it was an older woman who I had only recently become friends with. And she was the only person in the whole community who stood up for me in the incident that had occurred that had led me to walk down this road by myself. So actually, I ended up waiting for her. I knew that there would be both my host and probably this woman looking for me. And so I was driven back by someone who was profoundly on my side. Probably the only person who was profoundly on my side. And from there, I was actually a little nervous. My flight was in only a day or two. I was a little nervous that my regular host, who I realized was profoundly not on my side, I was worried she might not drive me to the bus station. Or maybe not print my ticket for me. So she did. But up until that point, I had never felt that way. I had never thought of the community I was in as having any characteristics of a cult. After that incident, it was starting to be very suspicious. And the thing that made it suspicious was that the source of the problem seemed to be that I was unwilling to give all of my power away to the individual who was the leader of that particular community. I was unwilling to worship that person as a god, of which actually many people did in the community. And we're talking here about some sort of delicate, subtle, spiritual occurrences here, because there are, like I said earlier, there is a part of everyone that is the source of God. And there are people who can very clearly allow their behavior to originate from that point instead of originating from what we might call the ego. And those people are sometimes called gurus. And they are very clear pointers for other people to show that, ideally to show you the source of God within you. The problem happens when a guru starts pointing you towards themselves as a person and creating dependencies on themselves as a person, rather than using the role of a teacher to point back to the source of God within the people who follow them. And this, I am afraid, is what was happening, what had started to happen, what had crept up on me and everyone, and what hadn't really been there from the beginning, or what hadn't been apparent from a distance. So there are a lot of people these days who are down on gurus, but I'm down on more than just gurus. I'm down on cults in general. And it's because of the phenomena of not just worshiping a person as God, but all too often worshiping a man as God. This is something we have been unconsciously raised to do since we were very young. And this is a term that I am borrowing from a book called Beyond God the Father by Mary Daly. And the term is called God-Man and God-Man syndrome. So what is a God-Man? Because it sounds sort of absurd, but it is absurd. But we unconsciously do this without identifying what it is, and the term almost makes the practice, it almost reveals the absurdity of the practice. So again, let's go back to a message I've talked about in countless videos, where because we are collectively afraid of pain and death and the unknown in our lives, we have been unconsciously trained to use blame as a way to offset that fear onto others. Specifically, men have learned to offset this fear onto women. And it's created myths like the old religious myth of Adam and Eve, in which Adam blames Eve for the fall of man. Essentially, as I've explained many times, Adam comes into the knowledge of the fear of death and pain and illness in life outside of this mythical Garden of Eden, and blames Eve for getting them kicked out and for therefore having to experience all of the bad things in life. It's a way of explaining why we face difficult things in life, but the explanation is it's Eve's fault. Eve is the seductress. Eve was tempted by the snake. Eve is untrustworthy. And so this becomes a problem between not just you and me, but between Adam, a man, and Eve, a woman. We also see in this myth that we're told that Adam is created in the image of God, who is a man, whereas Eve is created from Adam's rib. And there is no female counterpart. There is no female God that created Eve. Eve is not a god. Eve is an afterthought in Adam's world, where Adam is a god and made in the image of the God, who is pictured as a man with a beard. We see this in paintings. The famous painting of God reaching out and touching Adam's finger, giving him the gift of life, where Eve is not present, and the image of what God is very clear. Old man with a beard, and young Adam, the Son of God. So that's why this book, this feminist book by Mary Daly, is called Beyond God the Father, because it takes us beyond the idea of God as only a man, as only a father. And it specifically highlights the problem of having Adam, a man made in the image of God, whereas Eve is basically the villain in the story. So women are forever the secondary villain, and men are forever in the image of God. Now, whether or not you believe in this myth, this is a social pattern that persists across all cultures, and it's fueled by not only our collective fear of pain, but many men have this fear, haven't learned that pain simply erases false layers of our ego, and that underneath those layers we're encouraged to find the real source of God that doesn't have a gender, that is energy, and that this source of God exists equally in both men and women and all people of all races and all living things. Adam was never encouraged to do that. He didn't know. The easiest thing was to blame Eve. Eve, the weaker party, is now at risk and is now threatened by Adam. And so she finds ways to go along with this. And her biggest fear is the fear of not being safe, of being harmed by Adam. And so she takes on this consciousness as a way to protect herself and society. Her biggest, in a state of fear, her biggest priority is safety. And Adam, as worshipped as a god, seems to provide that safety when, in fact, the real source of not being safe is not being able to see clearly where the source of God is in times of fear and pain, and that Adam himself is the majority of the threat. In modern times, you will see that we actually live in a cult-based society precisely because of this unconscious social pattern. We are unconsciously conditioned to worship men as if they are gods, and for women to be followers and supporters, precisely because if they don't, they seem to risk their own safety. This is how the false matriarch forms, another term from Mary Daly's book. The false matriarch will prioritize the needs, the wishes, the desires, and the power of men because she is prioritizing safety. But this therefore harms the true interests and independence and power of women. She becomes the anti-feminist woman because she's afraid to risk her own safety. This exact pattern played out the night I had to walk by myself down a dirt road in a foreign country. This exact pattern is playing out right now around a certain individual who may or may not be named Trump. This exact pattern has played out in both dangerous and maybe not as dangerous, but still toxic social situations across our society here in the United States and all societies across the world. What happens when we start to worship men as gods rather than worship the true source of God within ourselves? To see ourselves in the image of God rather than just one man. What happens is we give so much power to this one man who shouldn't have that power in the first place because he is not God. He is a man that has been basically given power he should never have had, which is the power that you should reclaim for yourself. It's false power, and it inevitably leads to abuse. And unfortunately, especially when we have a situation where there are female followers of men in the image of God, we almost always have sexual abuse. Pretty much always. It blows my mind how often we see sex abuse in these cult situations where it is led by a man who is worshipped as a god, the God man. Probably the greatest God man of all time is Jesus Christ. He didn't start out that way. I don't believe he, as a person, intended it to be that way. In fact, if he were still alive, I believe he would actively work to dismantle the worship of his own image as the Son of God, or the only Son of God. I believe he was saying that he was a son of God, the way that you are a son or a daughter of God, the way that we all are. I believe that was his true message and intent, and that he really did want to point back to the God that lives in each and every one of us. And that was his way of showing it through metaphor. God, my Father. I am a son of God. God lives in me, but God lives in you also, underneath those layers. Unfortunately, what I started to see in my particular situation was the worship of a man that people called the living God, but then who never allowed his followers to believe they had also found that within themselves. There was an ongoing erosion of people's self-worth and self-esteem. And ironically, every single one of that person's followers was probably more egoless and empty than the leader himself. It was like he had taken the energy of those around him for himself, left everyone else empty, but then not in a way where you're empty because you're filled with the knowledge that you are the pure source of consciousness, but empty in a way where he was the pure source of consciousness and everyone else was just slightly less than. This is the recipe for a cult. It is the dynamic of a cult. And it creeps up on you and becomes profoundly dangerous. It sort of happens over time. And it does take someone with both extreme independence of thought, extraordinary self-confidence, and an intense dose of being a loner to acknowledge and recognize that and be able to step to the side and say, something's not right here. And if I had daughters of my own, which I don't because I don't have kids, I would never let them go into the situation that I was in. Nothing bad happened to me while I was there or after, but also nothing good happened to me. All that happened was an attempt to erode very clear wisdom that I've had through my very own experiences of, ironically, pain and suffering. So, to kind of wrap this little video up, I do want to talk briefly about my own organization, which I had always called Sruti Sangha. First of all, I did not change my name to fit into this group. I use this name Shruti that I picked myself from a person named Ramana Maharshi who had found direct wisdom from his own experiences. Ramana Maharshi did not have a guru. I myself never religiously followed any guru. There were multiple spiritual teachers I was interested in and who I made aware of my presence. This particular one that ended with me walking down a dirt road in a foreign country, I saw or thought I saw at one point in him a truth that I myself had recognized and therefore wanted to be close to people who I believed had also recognized it. It did not dawn on me until Ish got weird that a dynamic had either always been there that I hadn't seen or had changed, in which there was now a worship of a man rather than a collective worship and a true pointing to the real source of God that doesn't have a gender, that lives equally inside of all of us, that we can come to through many different pathways. For me, most of it was pain. I'm pretty upfront about that. There have been teachers who have helped accelerate what I've seen, but only if my intuition has deemed it appropriate for me to be involved. I would always recommend to anyone that they filter any truth through their own intuition and find what works for them and is best for them. There is no one single way to find the truth of who you are. There are healthy and unhealthy dynamics, though. And there is a structure to consciousness that is fundamental to how consciousness is built. That is what I talk about, is the structure of consciousness. There are layers. There are parts of ourselves underneath those layers. We are at once none of the layers and also all of the layers. These very subtle forms of spiritual awakening may or may not be interesting to you depending on what route you're taking and where you are in your journey. At the end of the day, it should be a teacher's goal that the people they speak to find the same understanding that they themselves have found. That the more people awaken around you and realize their equality to you, actually the better all of life gets. Not just for those people who are awakening, but also for that teacher. Life gets better for that person whose goals should be the freedom and equality of those around them. It should not be threatening. Awakening is not a competition. It is not a goal. It is not a threat. Because the result of awakening is coming into a higher love and a greater order of which the universe can provide exponentially more for everyone at the same time. That's the real meaning of not having a scarcity mindset. There is so much abundance of freedom. There's abundance of resources. There's abundance of love. There's abundance of connection. There's abundance of learning. Literally everything gets better the more awake people are around you. So to the teacher, there should not be the threat of those around you having a true and real and equal awakening. What I will also note, and part of the reason I started something called Sruti Sangha, which sounds like a Sangha is a community and Sruti is my name. It sounds like it's based around me. And in some ways, it is. I wrote a book. I have a message. Authors, creators, artists, they all have platforms based around them to a certain degree. I've had followings for my artwork. I've had followings for my book. I've had followings for things I've said. I have not wanted people to worship me as if I am God. However, I do want to say that something very irritating to me is how easily people will not want to worship the form of a young woman and say that they are free and equal to you, but then turn around and very easily give all their power away and worship a man as a god, which shows me that there's actually a level of disrespect in there where they never viewed the source of God within me as equal to them. In fact, they viewed me as less and were unwilling to have me as their teacher. That does irritate me. I can see how that would irritate other people with who are suffering from being unconsciously viewed as an object and through the lens of hierarchy. And women and people of other races are still viewed as objects who are lower on the rungs of hierarchy. So if you were, say, a black man, I think you might be irritated too, how easily it is for people to worship lighter-skinned male gurus, but you yourself are never going to be chosen as the guru, only because you have black skin. So at some point you might get so irritated that you choose yourself. And when people don't worship you, you might take that as an insult because of all of the oppression you've already experienced in society where people put you lower than them. And you can sense it energetically. So I see this, for example, like in Hillary Clinton. She comes off as rather harsh from time to time. She talks a lot about herself, more sometimes than people seem to want to hear, because it looks like she's quite self-centered sometimes. To me, what I see in her is someone who has been consistently put down, consistently underestimated, and consistently objectified, as compared to, for example, her husband, who was so easily elected as president, and she never was. So there's kind of two sides to this coin here, where naming an organization after myself in that way, putting myself at the center, you'd think it could be sort of encouraging a cult formation. But how rare is it that cults form around young women who don't want followers? And how easily cults form around men who will actually abuse you. I mean, it makes me very angry that society insists on operating in this toxic, hurtful, abusive manner. And then when someone like me puts themselves at the center of their own organization, which is a way of reclaiming my narrative, taking back my power, and forming a framework around myself so people don't abuse me, it's viewed as like arrogant and selfish and inappropriate somehow. So this is just my experience of having done this, of calling this organization Sruti Sangha, seeing the backlash, and then watching cults easily form around godmen. I mean, I watched Wild Wild Country about the cult forming around Osho and was horrified and saw myself in so many different ways in that documentary, specifically in the woman who was closest to Osho, who had to leave the cult and who was then attacked and vilified by Osho himself. And yet no cults ever seem to have formed around her. She's still the villain. At the end of the day, there should not be a cult formation around anyone. But if temporarily it means that a cult forms around someone who is just fundamentally anti-cult, I would think it would help wake people up from the widespread majority of culture, cult mentality that we still all live in. So I actually don't mind if an anti-cult were to temporarily form around myself or my message, if it served to wake people up out of the actually abusive situation of having cults form around men who are seen as gods, including Jesus Christ and the followers of him as the only Son of God. Yes, that is controversial, but also no, it is not. It is just not. It is just so, it should be such a basic piece of knowledge these days that the real source of God is beyond all gender and lives equally in both genders. That either men or women could be seen in the image of God, but neither should be worshipped as gods. We should be treating each other as equals from a place of love that ultimately comes from a recognition, especially in times of pain, that the real source of our being is underneath every layer of false thought, false emotion, false logic, and the false sense that we are only these bodies that live for a finite period of time. The real source of consciousness after our body dies will not end. And that is not just a part of you, that is the truest source of you. Everyone has equal access to this knowledge. That is the ultimate purpose of why I share what I share and what I am pointing to. And it is just so flipping exciting. Like, the consequences of really living from that place are so much fun, so exciting, so magical. We are simultaneously living at a time of profound breakdown and collapse of society. Don't be frightened, because at the same time, we are finding true society, true community, and true abundance. This is a very exciting time when a new way of living is actually emerging out of a very old, broken mindset. As the old mindset crumbles and falls away like a false layer, there are many people realizing that what is true is what always remains, and what is true is actually love, and a very bright, open-ended, exciting new way forward. One in which we are going to have the opportunity to build new societies, new cities, new ways of living. And should we be able to experiment again with a new way of living like many people have tried and failed before, I think it's so important that we understand how these cult dynamics could potentially destroy the integrity of what we will be trying to build. Hey, thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about me, you can check out my website, which is www.meet-shruti.com, linked below. Also, since I am a vastly better writer than I am speaker, I'd highly recommend checking out my book, The Hidden Value of Not Knowing, also linked below on Amazon. And of course, I'm obligated to say you should like, subscribe, comment. See you next time.